Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Miriam Brode, and I'm the Program Director at URBAN-X. URBAN-X is a venture accelerator for startups reimagining city life built by Mini and the venture fund Urban Us. It's a pleasure to co-host today what we hope is the first of many events with Sidewalk Labs. At URBAN-X and Sidewalk Labs, we share a love for cities and a belief that new ideas can make city life brighter. We're excited about making the all-electric city a reality and supporting the people, policies, and innovations that move us in that direction. Cities are at the forefront of the climate challenge, and decarbonizing buildings has become a local leading priority. Globally, buildings account for roughly 0.5% of all carbon emissions, the world's single largest source of greenhouse gases. That makes electrifying our neighborhoods one of the most promising paths to a low-carbon future. Before introducing the moderator for today's conversation, I would like to take a quick moment to remind our audience that applications are open for our 10th cohort here at URBAN-X. We're looking to invest $100,000 in up to 10 early-stage startups with solutions for sustainable urban living. Applications close on Friday, May 14th, and the program will begin in August. We'll also be hosting our first ever 3-day URBAN-X Summit, June 1st through 3rd. To celebrate our latest class of startups, Cohort 9, alongside Canary Media. You can visit urbanx.com for more details on the summit or to apply to our next program. And without further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session, Eric Jaffe, Editorial Director at Sidewalk Labs. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you. And thank you to URBAN-X for co-hosting this event. I'm Eric Jaffe, Editorial Director at Sidewalk Labs. Sidewalk Labs is an urban innovation company that creates products and places to help cities tackle their biggest challenges. And there is no bigger challenge right now than achieving a clean energy future in a way that is affordable and equitable. And that is why I'm very excited to hear from this great group of panelists that we have with us today. And I appreciate everybody who has signed in and joined us virtually. Just so everybody knows, I'll be talking with the panelists for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have an open Q&A for the last 15 to 20 minutes or so. If you're watching, whatever platform you're using, you can post your questions in the chat, and our team will help make sure they get into the queue. So with that, I'm going to jump right in with Robin Beavers, one of our panelists. She is the founder and CEO of Blueprint Power. Blueprint works with large commercial real estate owners in New York City to sell flexible energy capacity into a clean energy market. And Robin, I know the audience would love to hear a little more about what you do with Blueprint. But I also have a question to kick things off for us, which is, when you think about the all-electric city, the all-electric future, what is the first thing we need to do right now to make sure we're on the path to getting there, right? The most immediate need in front of us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I think the most immediate need is to get some last friction out of some of the regulatory hurdles. And that's the in-between stuff, like improving the speed to permitting for on-site clean energy resources like solar and storage. It could be getting easier and faster access to data from buildings and the grid itself. And, helping make sure cities are ready to adopt technology faster and in a more streamlined way.
Great. I'm gonna turn now to my colleague at Sidewalk Labs, Emily Kildow. Emily has worked on our affordable electrification product for a while, and now works with our development team on a greenhouse gas calculator, as well as general sustainable infrastructure plans. Emily, you heard what Robin just said there. Same question to you. Would you build on anything that Robin said in terms of speed to permitting, things like data access, or would you imagine kind of a different first hurdle as we try to get down this path of an all-electric city? You're on mute, Emily.
Try that again. Really great question, and I 100% agree with what Robin is saying, and I'm going to be annoying, and I don't actually think that there is one thing that we have to do. It's unfortunately we have to do many things at the same time, in addition to kind of reducing the actual regulatory hurdles, increasing incentives, and making it work for the business side. It has to simultaneously be looked upon the supply side to make sure that as we electrify, that it's actually meaningful in decarbonization.
Great, and I will now turn to our third panelist here, Donnell Baird, who is the founder and CEO of BlockPower, which is a very exciting startup that analyzes, finances, and installs clean energy tech in urban buildings. Donnell, same question to you, although I also would ask, if you want to expand a bit on what BlockPower has been up to lately. I think everybody would love to hear about that too, but same question, first hurdle, first immediate need in front of us as we go down this journey that cities are taking toward the all-electric city.
Great. Well, delighted to be here. Can you all hear me?
Sound good.
Yeah.
Well, that's one hurdle down. Super excited to be here with these two superstar execs. I think the first hurdle is political will. In my view, I believe that the hardware exists, the software exists, the capital is available. What we need is political will. We need a leader in a city that's willing to stand up, that has the courage to make the commitment. We are going to be the first 100% green city in America or North America or the world. We are going to do it. Whoever does that first, that mayor is going to have access to all of the capital, resources, data, philanthropy, equipment that is necessary to green that city. So I think there's political courage that needs to be demonstrated here to take on embedded fossil fuel and real estate interests and actually commit to being the first all-electric, 100% renewable city. That's exactly what BlockPower is working on. We focus on the building space. We want to move buildings off of fossil fuels and demonstrate that it's possible, even without the very necessary regulatory improvements, et cetera. We know that this is possible now, so BlockPower focuses on demonstrating that. So we're decarbonizing buildings across New York City and across the country in order to help folks understand that this is something that's possible right now.
I will stick with you, Donnell, for a second here, and you're mentioning political will. Obviously, the public sector, you think, needs to play a really strong role. But the private sector also has a role in this, and I'm curious kind of how you see that balance needing to play out. How do we shape that balance so that public and private sectors are working together on this in a way that has good outcomes for residents, for people, and for businesses and real estate?
Yeah, I mean, so to be totally self-serving as a startup CEO, we had an announcement on Earth Day last week. The Lieutenant Governor of New York State joined us on a Zoom meeting to help us kick off a new project that we have, which is we are going to work with a couple hundred houses of worship across New York State, some in New York City, some in the suburbs, some upstate. And we are going to decarbonize these houses of worship, the synagogues, the churches, the mosques, the rectories, the Catholic schools, the affordable housing and low income and senior housing that are associated and owned by these faith communities. The state's contributing $4.5 million, not a ton of money, but the private sector is going to contribute 22 million. So we're going to leverage every taxpayer dollar that's contributed with $3 or $4 or $5 from the private sector. We're going to create jobs. We're going to train and hire low-income people, veterans, people from vulnerable communities. We're going to train them in how to install all-electric heat pumps, and we're going to finance and install these heat pumps in churches. So the $4.5 million is critical. We need it in order for the economics of building-by-building heat pumps to pencil out and be financeable by the private sector. So we do need that $4.5 million, but we also need the 20 plus million from the private sector as well. So we're grateful to our partners at the New York Green Bank and Goldman Sachs and others who we're working with on that decarbonization project. And we think projects like that can be scaled up all the way up to city scale. And we're working on trying to get a commitment to, from a mayor who's going to be the first city to go all electric. We won't, announce before he does, but we are trying to scale this kind of project up so that we can demonstrate the first all electric city.
We won't tell anyone. You can tell us.
I shouldn't. I've said too much.
All right, we'll let you go on that one. Emily, I know, just drawing on what Danelle is saying, in terms of the role private sector real estate has to play in terms of embracing electrification, embracing decarbonization. You work with developers a lot. You know that there is an amount of risk aversion. You know that there are obviously huge upfront costs. What do you see as needed to shift the mindset for private sector real estate development to embracing this challenge more wholeheartedly?
Yeah, I mean, all the things that you listed are definitely barriers. And I think, the way that we think about decarbonization is really to holistically look at districts and you're not just thinking about electrification. Electrification is a tool in the toolbox. And once you start to set up how the district looks against how cities view carbon, and you start to break down the components where building electrification does X, Y, and Z, what does that do? It increases the actual amount of electricity that you're using, which can increase costs for people. So how do you offset that using things like thermal resources to not from a fossil fuel perspective, but from heat pumps like Danelle's company is doing, to actually lower the demand, and teaching them those steps and incremental steps where it's not this, sometimes you talk to a customer about electrification and it's scary. What about gas for cooking? There's a lot of questions, but if you start to break it down into these little sections, it starts to feel a little bit more manageable, and you're also able to articulate the benefits within each of those contributions. So I think that's how you start with the private sector. You have to have a financial plan, a feasibility plan that looks at the amortization of the assets and the extra money that you're putting in at the initial stages and how that plays out over time, and have that pretty well established before it has the opportunity to be value engineered out, and really kind of set the stage and create the partnerships early so that you're not seeing these things as highlighted items in the planning side and the neighborhood community meetings, and then when you see it built, you're like, that's not exactly what they said they were going to do. And I think, and that's specifically for some of the new development projects, partnering with existing developments as assets, as places that have extra heat that you can utilize, and start to really just think about the energy that's being pumped into cities as an asset and how to share those resources within the communities. And that takes also restructuring how we think about how you buy and sell energy and the contracts between those different parties. And so I think it's really a layered approach. It's figuring out how to sell it to people so they understand it, they feel comfortable with it, and then helping them set up the mechanism so that will come to fruition down the line.
Robin, I want to draw on what Emily's saying in terms of needing this market of buying and selling energy. That's obviously right at the heart of what you and your team are doing. As you work with large building owners, large buildings in New York, what is moving the needle with them in terms of getting buy-in toward making the types of changes that you're asking of them in participating in this market?
Sure. I mean, I think there are several drivers and levers for our large commercial real estate partners. When we founded Blueprint, the focus on building decarbonization was still not mainstream. And our main value proposition to the real estate owners was the financial return for them. It was the fact that energy markets and utility markets and other local markets were saying, we'll pay for flexible capacity from your buildings. And that was exciting. And, that was enough to get initial interest from our real estate partners. The additional layers of decarbonization, the trillions of dollars that are being organized and used to accelerate ESG goals and delivery are also helping here, in addition to the regulatory kind of energy transition tailwind that's happening. And one thing, though, I wanted to point out that is really particularly interesting for Blueprint and for our partners is how different market signals align and match with decarbonization goals. So, the reason a lot of these markets are opening up to accept flexible capacity, the grid needs flexible capacity, is because it gets constrained, or things like offshore wind are coming, or a lot of EVs are coming. All the things we love can actually stress the grid out, and the grid needs help, and it needs help from local flexible capacity. And so market design has been shifting in that direction to incent, flexible response for certain needs. What's really exciting now is that you can factor in real-time carbon signals as well. So, we've been talking a lot about building-specific decarbonization, but by doing that, the buildings actually help the grid decarbonize. 100% electrification only makes sense if your electricity is clean, is carbon-free. And we all know that that's not the case with grids today. So it's kind of a cool, reinforcing mechanism, buildings that adopt, new technologies and generation and storage to green themselves, they can actually help the grid heal itself and host and support even more large-scale renewables, electrification and mobility, all the things we want to make 100% electrification actually a good idea. So I think for us, that's really exciting. And, I agree with Danelle that cities are really the leader of that. And there is a huge opportunity for a city to step forward because it really, it expands out from regional networks, beyond. So yeah, that's just want to throw that here for the audience, because a lot of different signals, price points, co-optimizations can kind of all come together to finally align the value of carbon with, other values like the financial drivers of the grid today.
I want to stick with you, Robin, for a second to draw on this point you're making of, needing a fully green grid for electrification to even make sense. And we were talking about this earlier prior to the event, and you were saying that the timeline really matters with this, and that nobody ever really talks about that. So we're gonna have the chance to talk about that now. But what you think about that timeline of the timeline of the all-electric city versus the timeline of greening a grid, how those things match up, how you kind of sequence and balance those, you're going to solve it for us.
Yeah, well, and that's linked to my first answer, which is, the speed of adoption, or how easy it is for buildings or other parties to adopt these new available commercialized technologies that deliver, decarbonization outputs and outcomes. Right now, time is the thing against us, and that, things are slow because of processes and markets and non-technological reasons. So that's just, I think, a major area where we can focus. But also, yeah, over the next 5 to 10 years, and this is a discussion happening across many, and to keep it very New York City specific, a lot of working groups for Local Law 97 and other, major, climate initiatives, is how you can use real-time data to inform the right real-time decisions in this transitional period. So there might be, for a few years, where certain decisions on how to manage or operate a building is actually better compared to the grid's current, carbon coefficient, but that'll change in 2 years because the grid's greening up, or, the other local factors. That is data, those are data-driven decisions. So I think that, to me, can help solve that speed to electrification issue, or speed to 100% clean grid. There's a lot, everyone's doing their part right now. There's tons of money. We know offshore wind's coming. There's a lot of great things happening. It's just the timing. So, using informed decision-making capabilities will help ensure along the way, we're doing the best we can. We're optimizing for the right carbon outcome and financial outcome, of course.
Right. I want to ask Danelle a question about a point he raised also earlier in a conversation before the event. It was really intriguing to me, so I'd love for him to unpack it a bit more. This idea of kind of decentralizing electricity, and you said it, you described it as kind of making it more like smartphones, and I love that idea, even though I don't exactly know what it means. So would you kind of let us know what that might look like for the average person to have that kind of power, almost literal power in their phones, and how that would change the type of conversation we're having here?
I certainly think that if you remember how big giant cell phones were, and even before cell phones, all of the infrastructure, telecom wires that we needed to have landlines. I mean, my cousin was the economic advisor minister in Liberia. They had a 12-year civil war. After the war, they didn't rebuild all the telephone landlines. In 2007, they just gave everybody a cell phone, right? You don't need all this infrastructure because, as Robin pointed out, technology is advanced. And so, in my view, energy is going to move away from large, centralized fossil fuel infrastructure to more modular, decentralized, distributed energy resources. And as we get to scale, those DERs are going to become more and more efficient, and more affordable, and more modular, hopefully. And hopefully there'll be some interoperability between the different devices. I'm sure Emily and Robin understand the stuff way better than I do. But in my view, just like cell phones have brought computational power, down to, a pocket-sized computer, whereas computers used to be giant mainframes that took over whole rooms and whole buildings. We're eventually going to be able to scale down energy production and consumption to something that's much more personal and much more modular. And so that's the future of energy. And as we're planning what the grid is going to look like, one, we need to think about which parts of the grid already look like that today in terms of the distribution of appliances and kind of their role in the grid. But I think that's where things are headed. From my standpoint, as we roll out this distributed smart green infrastructure in low-income communities and communities of color, we want this new infrastructure to be owned and operated by historically disenfranchised communities so that they can ride the upside of this new wave of distributed green infrastructure.
Emily, I would ask you to kind of draw on that a bit in terms of what the role of centralized infrastructure in this world Donnell's describing, where we're kind of moving away from that. Well, first of all, do you think that is kind of the direction we're going? But if so, kind of what does that mean for utilities, right? I know you think a lot about the way that the rate structure has to change to kind of achieve some of the affordability goals that we have with the current centralized system. I know there's a lot there, but thinking about that in context of what Donnell just said, how would you pose that future?
Yeah, it's a combination of what Donnell said and what Robin said, which, there's the decentralization of assets and making the grid really a series of distributed energy resources. And that can be a building that also uses energy, but also that it's dynamic, and that the way to really achieve that in a way that you're making sure you're maximizing the coefficient of performance for every piece of energy that moves through the system, every piece of heat that moves through the system, that it's dynamic and that those things are interconnected. And so, when we're trying to talk about district systems, I always have this kind of moment of aha, where we're not talking about just centralizing a mini plant within a district. We're talking about this like higher level kind of almost like a virtual type of microgrid, which I don't believe that's actually a term, but the concept is there where it's about understanding what's happening from a higher level and then being able to trade those resources between. And so from a physical infrastructure piece, the concept of a heat pump is really nice because you're able to stick that anywhere and trade energy. And so you almost create like a financial market within buildings where you can buy and sell energy. And so decentralizing that from a utility where you're just buying and they have control over, oh, you have extra? Well, we'll only pay you a third of what you're generating, which obviously is disenfranchising to people to actually incentivize them to do it. So if you make it so that it's more of an open market and really focus on the distributed resources, also just the way that you build and the interconnectability of your spaces, that just opens up that market potential and then also allows for the affordability piece and for it to actually be a moneymaker for people who want it to be.
Robin, I'd ask you to chime in here since this is right in your wheelhouse. How do you see this working in terms of trading resources across buildings?
Across buildings, yeah. So you can either do it virtually through creating some sort of credit or virtual system that helps buildings and build in our, in Blueprint's case, portfolio owners, people who own lots and lots of buildings, to think holistically about that footprint, and like not every building is the same for what it can produce or what it can do, and other buildings can, help balance. So it's like it's balancing its own footprint. It becomes its own flexible power network in a way, and you can orchestrate, with transparency and, data visibility, the right kind of quote unquote market there. In order, and then now Blueprint, again, you can help trade your flexible capacity by using the existing grid and the current markets that are out there. It's very hodgepodgey, the different markets that exist to buy flexible capacity. They're across I call them different policy layers. They all have different bosses. They have different rules. They're not coordinated. And so, that's people like us. That's what we do. We string it all together to make it valuable. But ideally, there'd be one nice coordinated network marketplace where there's clear incentives and, clear rules and clear values. And, people are focused more on the performance versus, understanding how it works. So I think a lot of the energy marketplace, reform that is currently happening regionally, as energy tends to be, I think there's becoming a more collective thought about, maybe there is a streamlined approach to this, and it's about how you affect that market redesign in a less hodgepodgey way. So a lot of people like to refer back to, the Rural Electrification Act in that era, and thinking about how quickly the U.S. was able to electrify, like the first time, this is all almost 100 years ago, and think about how, what were the things that worked in that moment to deliver such impressive results in like 15 years, which is what really happened. The U.S. fully electrified within a 15-year period. And how do you think about that now with like this new electrification challenge? And, it has to kind of deal with legacy and entrenched rule makers and layers, but there's a lot of people trying to think about that right now. So that's not an answer. It's just a thought to throw out there.
It's okay. It's great. And I would remind our viewers, if they have thoughts, to put them in the chat, and we will get to those in a few minutes. I want to kind of back up a second and kind of return to this issue of affordability, because it's one that when we put a notice out about this event that I kept getting emails about from folks. And we know that, there's almost, I think, a third of U.S. households that struggle to pay their energy bills. And we've been talking at the market level, at the systems level, at the infrastructure level. If we bring it down to the kind of the resident, right? How do we ensure that affordability, that really, environmental justice are built into this future, and that they're not an afterthought? And what is that going to mean day to day for somebody who's trying to pay their energy bill? And I pose that to anyone who wants to jump in. I know maybe Danelle wants to start first, because I know that's near and dear to what you do.
Yeah, it's very central. We're a public benefits corporation focused on, scaling solutions to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, but also economic development and workforce development in financially underserved communities. It's in our charter documents, and actually I can't be sued by our investors if I choose to prioritize social and environmental benefit over profitability, which got to read the fine print, VCs. But I think we're really proud to continue to pursue an implementation of decarbonization in buildings as an expression of potential environmental justice. We haven't figured it all out, but we do know that the baseline principle of Silicon Valley, build something that's better, that's faster, that's cheaper, that's smarter, applies here. So we're very focused on what kind of software, what kind of data do we need to organize, what kind of software do we need to build, what kind of structured financial product do we need to develop. Our partners at Goldman, at the New York Green Bank, Inclusive Prosperity Finance have been very patient with us to develop a structured financial product that allows us to amortize the upfront cost of heat pumps and other energy efficiency measures over 10 to 15 years, thereby reducing the monthly payments that need to be made, and turning CapEx into OpEx by leasing these energy efficiency and building electrification technologies to low income and moderate income buildings over time. And so if you think about it as a green equipment lease or a green mortgage, we're stretching out the upfront cost of these technologies in a way that makes it affordable. I think the second point is these buildings are incredibly wasteful of fossil fuels, right? So the energy intensity per square foot in low-income buildings, because of a history of redlining, because of a history of neglect, lack of access to capital, lack of access to technical expertise of any kind, or much less sustainability expertise, these buildings waste a ton of fossil fuels. When we think about the 5 million small, medium enterprise buildings across the country, medium-sized buildings in communities throughout the country, the EIA says that these buildings waste over $100 billion per year. That's like not their full energy cost. That's the amount of energy that they pay for and waste, right? Relative to what they should be doing if they had energy efficiency and heat pumps and other technology. So there's a tremendous amount of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, that's being wasted annually in buildings across the country as we overconsume and waste fossil fuels. So what we want to do is reduce the amount of energy that's needed in these buildings. We want to, upgrade the buildings, make them more efficient, reduce the overall amount of emissions, reduce the amount of overall energy that's needed to heat and cool these buildings or to produce hot water. Obviously, where we can install solar and LED lighting, obviously you want to do that and really try to decarbonize that building. And we believe that there is a way to do that lowers costs for low-income building owners and tenants, and are demonstrating that. So, we've completed projects in over 1,100 apartment buildings and schools and synagogues and churches and mosques, mostly throughout New York City, and have a pretty good data set on how to make all this stuff work. And we're, very proud that we were able to recently structure an agreement with Goldman Sachs where they agreed to finance these projects with us, all over New York State.
Emily, as Danelle's talking about buildings being wasteful, that's something I know you know a lot about in working with our affordable electrification team, which tries to use kind of automation as one way to help get at that. what are some of the approaches you think can work to create more affordability when it comes to an electrified future?
Yeah, and I think Donnell really landed on a lot of them. And one thing that we're not talking about as much, but the thermal envelope of buildings in general, especially that were built in 30s and 40s, are so terrible that that doing that first is already going to kind of cut your energy demand 20% plus. So there's this kind of physical piece that we can't forget before we start to overlay technology that helps kind of get you over the thresholds. But I think that maybe the thing that wasn't discussed, and we have talked about this, so I know that Donnell's on board, that like the idea of having community solar and having ownership as part of the community model. So again, it's about restructuring how things are financed. So if there's ownership or even renter ownership of certain shares of solar and battery, and then potentially a way through technology to understand when you are actually wasting energy on top of, just the way that the building would perform. But are you leaving appliances on that don't need to be? Could you ramp down your refrigerator when you're not home because you're not opening it? And having the interconnection between end-use devices that you could actually say, yeah, I'm on a budget, I want to save money, and that will do automated optimizations for you and lower costs. Somebody made an earlier point that the technology is there. You can talk to your devices. There's refrigerators that you can, put things on your grocery list from afar. Like, you can do all of these things. It's about the limitations of why these things aren't connecting from a business perspective. And so opening that up, making it so that there's market drivers to allow for people to have access to the technology and be able to have more control over the way that they use energy, and that the way that they could save energy will potentially, make it at least more affordable to a certain extent. But there's a lot of work that has to be done just in general for reducing costs of electricity, especially if we're going to electrify, to make it actually affordable for everybody.
Robin, how do you think about this coming from the commercial building perspective? Obviously, it's a little different, but we know retailers, especially small businesses, they're hurting too right now. And so as you think about affordability with the markets Blueprint is enabling, kind of where do you land in terms of how you can make that happen?
I think one important place to focus is utilities and how they set rates and how they justify those rate increases over time. And this is just in general, but utilities increasingly will need to meet their return on investment hurdles by investing more money, and which is great. The grid, a lot of things need investment, but there's it's sort of a weird incentive for them, but you don't want electricity costs to go up unnecessarily from the utility. So, and this is very generic, of course, but electrification is providing a lot of justification for reinvestment, a lot of proposals for expensive things, and there's ways to do it more cost effectively. And it can be done in an optimized way so that it doesn't hit the people who can't afford it. And I think that is a very important piece of this puzzle, is to make sure there's transparency around how electricity rates are set over the next 10 years, and to make sure they don't go too high, and to make sure that there is transparency in the justifications for those things. And I fear that there will be a lot of excuses for justifying the cost of electricity to go a lot higher than it needs to be. And that can just be because electrification is gnarly. There's a lot of things. Everything we're talking about is like hard to track. It's hard to know how they're going to sync up and what's going to happen. So it's a big opportunity to kind of cover that with, the need to raise electricity rates. And I just think that would be an unfortunate outcome of this. So there should be a lot of focus on how those rates are set in the utility tariff process. Right.
And it is the transparency there so that everyone can see what's happening. make sure that's being set in a justified and justifiable way. I'm going to turn to our first question from the viewers here. This is a question from Kareem Muhammad Ali, who's on Zoom, and he wants to ask Donnell, you mentioned political will as the major roadblock to achieving an all-electric city. I'd imagine this requires cooperation at the city, state, and federal levels. What do you specifically hope to see from mayors, governors, and national leaders to make that political will come together?
Great question. Last 4 years were incredibly depressing time for myself and tens of millions, maybe even over 100 million Americans were depressed. Maybe 200 million, maybe both sides were depressed. Shit, I don't know. It's pretty bad. But what was interesting is, as one of a very early Obama supporter who quit my job and moved down to rural South Carolina to work as a senior staffer on the very first Obama campaign, one of the things that happened when we won that Obama campaign in 2008 is everybody's like, we got Obama in there. Now it's time to chill out. And I think what happened when Trump got in there is like cities and states were like, literally nothing good will happen with regard to climate change mitigation unless it happens at the local level, right? Cities, states took it upon themselves to pass aggressive climate legislation. And so you saw over 200 cities pass legislation that they were going to be 100% renewable by 2030, 2040, 2050, right? In California, you see 30, maybe it's 40 cities that have banned fossil fuels in new construction in their buildings, starting with Berkeley, right? Here in New York City, we're talking about banning fossil fuels in new buildings, and I'm fighting like hell to get Mayor de Blasio and his team to ban all of fossil fuels and kind of lead the country. And again, as Robin echoed, like we're done here. Like we don't need fossil fuels in buildings, right? Like this isn't ancient Mesopotamia. Like we're past burning oil in buildings, and so we do need collaboration between city, state, and local levels. But I think that, the Jeffersonian idea or whatever it is of the states as the laboratories of democracy and blah, blah, blah. You see the bad side of that with Texas and Houston. Some would say California. But I think that here in New York State, we can continue to try and lead the way and demonstrate to folks that as a hyper-affluent, well-educated, progressive group of local leaders and startups, business leaders, civic leaders, academics, we can get together and start to demonstrate that electrification is possible. And I believe that when people take that first step, other parts of the society will follow. And so that first mayor that declares that they're going to green, I'm sure it's going to be a woman, that she's going to green the first American city and demonstrate that political courage and do that, there are going to be all kinds of folks at the state level, at the federal level, in the tech world who are excited about that vision and pile in. And so I do think there needs to be collaboration, but in order to get started, we just need some individual courage, political courage.
Yeah, and it's certainly been a troubling trend to see that some states are actually banning the city's ability to ban natural gas and to make some of those climate impact decisions on their own. And that's something that I know everybody in this field is watching very closely.
It's a fight. It's a fight, and we have to win it. Build something better.
All right, I'm going to go to a next question here coming from LinkedIn. This is from Erica Vincent, who says, and I'm going to pose this one first to you, Emily, I think. But Erica asks, where do you see better public transport fitting into an all-electric city to reduce congestion and carbon emissions? I know, Emily, you've thought a lot about the way EVs will kind of integrate into a broader electrified grid. What do you think about Erica's question?
It's a great question. And, in cities, mobility is sometimes, 30-40% of the total carbon emissions. And so just figuring out ways to reduce individual personal automobile use through shared parking strategies, by just creating it to be more expensive, parking costs, congestion pricing, like New York City is doing. Those things all are to the benefit in general of carbon reduction. But there's an opportunity to think about EVs as another distributed energy resource. So there's definitely, risks to the grid. And Robin mentioned earlier, this is maybe one of the excuses that will happen from the utility side where, well, we need to support the peak demand and we don't know what that is. And with electrification and EVs coming on board, we are going to have to build, infrastructure that's going to mitigate these superchargers when in fact, yes, that they might take energy at certain times, but there's ways to supplement with batteries by using the car's batteries themselves as assets and putting the smarts on those different assets to actually, again, become resources. So it's, again, just distributing all of those pieces, tying them all together. Transportation is a huge, huge piece of that puzzle.
Okay, we have a question, another LinkedIn question that I can put Robin's way. This is from Taylor Lefton, who asks, I only understand a little bit of your question here, Taylor, but I think Robin will understand all of it. How much opportunity is embedded in PACE financing, and how much of the costs are usually allowed in office renovation projects that we can underwrite? I guess, another way to ask this, Robin, is what options exist for commercial buildings to do better?
Great. Yes, I think CommercialPACE financing has come a long way and has found some momentum, and it's a great option for commercial building owners. But there are many types of financing options out there, including, the building owners themselves. But it's one tool in the toolkit. In terms of the tactics that buildings can adopt to become decarbonized, flexible sources of supply, you can add behind the meter distributed energy resources, things like solar and batteries. You can add EV charging infrastructure in the way that Emily was just describing. It's full of potential to be part of this kind of optimized solution. The way I always frame it is like every building has like some unearthed flexible capacity they just haven't found, and that can be done through better energy management. So not just, it's kind of like energy efficiency 2.0. We used to focus on reducing base load demand, but actually load can be useful. Sometimes you want to toggle it up or down based on what's going on elsewhere. So it's more about flexible load management versus just straight up reduction. You need all of it, but that's, it's an important part. So you can look at things like your HVAC systems, your lighting, and your thermal systems, and it gets really geeky really fast. And as someone who studied civil engineering in undergrad, I used to only think about building systems. It's cool. It's like back in vogue, but there's a lot of options. There's a lot of levers. There's heat pumps. There's we with Blueprint, we're connected to fuel cells, that do play a certain role in this equation. There's a lot of options out there, and it's just you need the right combination for each building, and what else is needed locally, and you bring it all together to provide the optimal solution. And kind of going back to some of the points we keep highlighting, like electrification should not lead to building, a peaker plant at every building, right? Like that's not the most cost-effective solution. And I think that's what we're all grappling at. You can do it in an elegant, optimal way, so that the utility, what you're paying per kilowatt hour from your utility is not, 30% more next year than it is this year, or the cost of capital can remain low, or the returns on that invested capital, wherever it's coming from, and this infrastructure is high, and you just get everything accelerating here, and everyone benefits. You're not kind of making it certain solutions for certain groups, and it is a systems problem at the end of the day, and so it can be solved that way elegantly. Easy, right?
I
No
think you're right. I
problem.
think building systems are like fashion. They're cyclical. They're going to come back. We have time for a couple more questions from the audience before we wrap up. I'm going to grab this one here from YouTube because I don't think we've had a YouTube question yet. And this one is not for any panelists in particular, although maybe Emily, I'm sure you have a perspective on this. The question is, decarbonization is a very multifaceted space of potential solutions: heat pumps, energy marketplaces, EVs, carbon sequestration, and so forth. How do you prioritize what to work on? So I think this gets back to kind of what we were talking about earlier about timing and sequence, some of the things you said, Robin, but how we prioritize, what levers to pull to get that grid green as soon as we can.
Well, I definitely have an opinion. One of the things that we've been working on at Sidewalk Labs is a GHG waterfall for new development. And so what that does is it takes carbon as the great neutralizer for sustainability and starts to look at the carbon impact within different verticals. So that includes energy and electrification, mobility, waste, water systems. And within water systems, we think about sequestration through primarily, stormwater mitigation strategies and green infrastructure. But there's like the whole other side of that coin and embodied energy. So all of those things are relevant. And I think it's confusing, unfortunately, because it's different everywhere. The grid impact's different. The distances that people drive because of the access to transportation is different. The weather is different. And so you really have to look at place-specific issues and then focus on what is the baseline for the actual GHGs for a per person capita. And then if you do an innovation in each of the categories, what is the actual reduction strategy? That sounds really tedious. It's actually not that tedious if you have a tool to do it, which we do. And there's a lot of other carbon footprinting applications that people have looked at. But I think that it is about trying to find the best fit for the specific site. And a lot of times, and I would say most times, it's somewhere between energy and energy and mobility are going to be your biggest bang for your buck. But you get triple bottom line benefits from other pieces that you kind of have to look at holistically. So it's a thought process exercise to determine kind of what your priorities are.
All right, I'm going to take one more question here from the audience, and then I have a wrap-up question for each of the panelists. But this question is from Philippe. It's a Zoom question, and it is for Danelle. Philippe says, I'm curious if you see your product providing energy back to a centralized grid, or if you would be comfortable moving forward solely with the decentralized community ownership model that you were talking about at one point.
Yeah, I think that there's some questions around interoperability, which I believe, Emily or Robin mentioned. I think part of what must happen here is interoperability of devices. Right now we've got these kind of siloed, walled gardens where manufacturers come up with their own devices that make it difficult oftentimes to figure out what's going on and kind of optimize and integrate energy devices with one another, even in the same building. I'm sure Robin has tons to say about this. Once you get over that interoperability problem and get to kind of a two-way communication middleware platform, which in my view should be free, right? I believe we need an open source, free, potentially cryptocurrency incentivized platform for developers all around the world to build connections and integrations between smart devices, and a free middleware platform that at least gets rolled out across New York State, if not the entire country. And I know the Department of Energy is funding some connected community programs around some of these concepts. With that kind of middleware protocol, that allows you to do some of the distributed energy resource management stuff that right now is being centralized with like Siemens or other folks. And again, Robin and Emily probably have more expertise on this than I do. But you can start to optimize and automate some of that. You can use machine learning for anomaly detection around how your devices are performing, almost like a Nest thermostat in the cloud, connected to other devices across different buildings, and you can start to network communities through your kind of middleware platform. So that starts to give you at least peak demand management flexibility, where you can preheat your hot water systems in the morning before most folks wake up and take their shower before their morning commute. You can start to preheat some of that hot water across the community and start to do neighborhood level peak demand management. And of course, to the extent that you can get your solar PV and other kinds of energy efficiency technologies involved, you can do really interesting stuff. Obviously, battery storage, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of wood to chop before we all get there, but that's where I believe we need to head.
Is Miriam on? I can't recall if we're ending at 5 p.m. Eastern or if we go till 5, a little after 5.
I think 5 was our time.
5 was the goal. All right. So then I'm gonna ask one final question here to each of the panelists, and it can be kind of rapid fire. But I was reading an interview about somebody saying, we're still not getting people excited about the climate challenge ahead of us and motivated in the sense of kind of really feeling the motivation. So I'm going to ask each of you, how do we get people excited or more excited? Since if you've attended this event, you're probably a little excited. How do we get people more excited about an all-electric future? And I will start with you, Robin.
Thanks. I don't know, my big peeve about the energy industry is the language. It needs like an update to language, it's very jargony. It's like sort of wonky, like it needs a rebranding. It needs an update. So I think it needs that. I am not that person to, I'm not very cool or flashy. So, but someone needs to do that. Change the language, have a better, shared agreed to language that gets us excited and motivates us all to get together.
I thought we agreed building systems are cool. Don't worry, you're cool.
Obviously we all think it's cool. But.
All right, challenge accepted on the language. I'll work on that for sure. Emily Kildow, how do we get people more excited?
The Jetsons. Everything is electric in the Jetsons. Everything is connected. And I don't know if you've ever been to anything that says it's a smart city. It's not yet, but electrification, interconnectability, that stuff can all happen. That's not really a thing, but that could work, right?
Cartoons are exciting. This is true. All right, Donnell, you get the final word here.
Oh, I believe it's through the integration of energy with health. The more we learn about how our buildings are energy wasting health hazards that are causing incredibly high rates of asthma, spreading mold, filled with lead and asbestos. The Bronx has the highest rates of chronic asthma in the country, right? Because the buildings, there's thousands of buildings that still burn oil 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year long, because the giant oil system is connected to the hot water heating system. And so you have to burn oil every day to produce hot water for people's showers. And so connecting that to the fact that the Bronx has the highest rates of chronic asthma anywhere in the country, and we have the opportunity to create jobs, rebuild this country while making our communities and buildings healthier, stronger, smarter, greener, more modern. I think it's really exciting personally, but once you start talking to people about their health and the health of their children and the fact that their home is making them sick because they have a gas oven that's poisoning everybody, I think people are going to get really excited in a hurry. So part of that is sensors, data collection that's going to allow parents to understand just how awful our homes and schools really are. And that's going to help people get excited and energized around this.
All right, we'll leave it at that. And I think, am I turning it back to you, Miriam, to thank our panelists?
No.
I'm happy to.
But hold on, you will
We don't
probably
need
hear me.
thanks. We're good. We're delighted to be
Yeah,
here.
this is fun.
So one
Great.
second. Okay, there we go. Yes, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Eric, also for facilitating this wonderful panel. I hope you stay connected. I hope you continue a conversation, and that, yeah, we can effectively get to this all-electric city, given all the potential excitement as our panelists just explained. Thank you everyone for connecting, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Electrify
Bye.
everything.
That's right.
Bye.
Bye.